Tonight we're talking about truth picks. Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
And your co-host Rich Gear here as well. And Doug, we have a very special guest. We've had him on before, and it's always an honor to have Dr. Jerry Bergman with us tonight. And what did you say? The title of the show is Truth Picks? Is that what it is? Truth Picks instead of Toothpicks, huh?
Yeah, that's right. And so
all right,
what we have to do is we have a choice between the truth or we can pick something else, which would be false. But the problem is that there's usually one story that has the truth, and to actually get precisely the truth is one thing, and sometimes you're a little bit off, and you might have a different spin on the truth that takes you in a whole different direction, and it ends up being false. And so,
well, that reminds me, Doug, of the scripture that Jesus says, "A little leaven can spoil the whole lump." You might have 90% right, actually, but the little 10% could poison the whole well.
So what we're doing, Rich, is we've got about six different little things, standalone topics that are some of Jerry Bergman's favorites.
Yes.
And the first one is freak shows. Jerry has researched what has gone on with circus freak shows back in the past and how it ties in with evolution. Tell us a little bit about that, Jerry.
Okay, there's quite a few examples. In fact, I have a whole book which I haven't even read yet, which has got 440 pages. But
Wow.
I've done reports of about 8 or 9 of them. And basically, you're talking about people who look more like monkeys or less evolved like us. And therefore, they're used to prove evolution. And of course, there are many examples of this. Probably the best example is Julia Pastrana. And there you can see that. That's Julia.
Wow.
And she was commonly used. Okay, she was used because she looks like a monkey. She has monkey traits. And she was used to prove evolution. She's called the ape woman. She was less evolved than we are. And it was claimed by various people that she was good evidence that we evolved from apes because she had many ape-like traits. She was used to prove evolution and for probably 60, 50 years. And it's kind of a tragic story in many ways because she was, of course, exhibited and people paid to see her. And ironically, when they paid to see her, she enjoyed it because she was a good actress. She was a good singer. She could put on a play. And so she didn't see herself exploited at all. And she was her manager wanted to marry her, and they did. And then when she died, she got pregnant, had a baby, and unfortunately, she didn't live. She died. Ironically, then, her, quote, loving husband had her body embalmed, and he wanted to continue displaying this person so she could continue to make money. So that said a lot about what his feelings were, not for her, but the fact that she was a good source of income. And again, when you look at her body, especially very, very hairy, she indeed did look somewhat ape-like. I'm not sure if they really thought she was an ape or less evolved than humans, but nonetheless, she certainly fooled the audiences. The audiences were convinced. They would say, look, Mama, there's a girl evolving. She hasn't evolved as much as we have. And so she indeed was used to sell the idea of evolution. And there are scores of examples, but Julie, of course, is one of the best well-known. But there are other examples as well. One I was looking for and I couldn't find the book.
When did she live? Jerry, when did Julie live?
She lived in 1934. She was born.
Wow. That late, okay.
Lived for 30 years displaying, and she was, quote, billed as the missing link of evolution. So there we go. Or the baboon lady.
So, Jerry, then how would you explain that from our point of view, creationists' point of view?
Well, she had a disease which basically caused her to be hairy, called her hirsutism, number one.
Oh, yeah.
And
I've
number
heard of that.
two, she had a deformity of her jaw, which allowed her to look more like a monkey. Her face really wasn't that different, but the jaw design, in her case, because of the deformity, allowed her to look very differently.
I think I was just seeing a article about the world's ugliest woman who had acromegaly, and she earned her living being in the freak show. And apparently, P.T. Barnum and treated his freaks pretty well. They paid him pretty well, but the whole thing uh, caused a belief that you were seeing evolution in action, and that's where the perniciousness of this whole concept comes in.
Well, there's also the story, I think they were in Freak Show, the Wolf Boys, or the family that they look like wolfmen, you know, like they always look like Lon Chaney back in the Wolfman days. Their whole face and body was covered with hair. Her suit, when you said that, I think they suffered from the same thing, but they didn't have a deformity of the jaw, but their whole face looked like was covered with hair, and so I don't know how they would explain that. Maybe it was that you were evolving from a wolf into a human rather than an ape. I don't know. I don't understand any of that stuff, quite frankly.
Well, freak shows were quite common for a long time. Now, of course, we don't feel that's appropriate to display these people. On the other hand, ironically, some of these people have said, look, I enjoy it. I make a living. It's easy work. I don't have to lug logs around for, in some sawmill for all day. So I enjoy it, and I realize I'm different. I realize no matter where I go, people are going to see me as a freak. I've accepted it, and therefore, I want to be able to make a living this way. So when these freak shows were stopped, among the opposers were not only the owners of these shows, but also the people who starred in them, because they wanted, now what am I going to do? Now how am I going to make a living?
Yeah,
Well,
there's always the law of unintended consequences that people who want to do good, but they don't understand some of the downside of their activism. I think so, but that seems to go with the territory. But
truth pick number two, Rich.
well, this one kind of goes along with the first one. It's Ota Benga,
Oh,
Jerry.
yeah, here's a
Yeah,
picture of him.
he's one of the more famous displayed people trying to prove evolution. Wasn't he the one? Wasn't he displayed? But he was in between or next to a monkey cage, and he's showing that he was an evolutionary link
Right.
from the.
He was in the Bronx Zoo in New York, and
Oh, New
he was
York.
brought
Okay.
over to be part of a fair, the St. Louis World's Fair, I believe. And him and other people, he was a pygmy, him and others started in this fair. And then when the fair was over, of course, he went back home. But unfortunately, when he went back home, most of his tribe was slaughtered, was killed. He had a family. He looked like he was 12, but he was actually, I guess, in his late 20s or middle 20s. And he had a family, had two or three children, had a wife, and they were all slaughtered. They were all killed because of a tribal warfare. And
Yeah.
so Berner was his caretaker. So what do? You bring him back to America. I mean, what else can he do? He doesn't have a family there anymore. So
Yeah.
he came to America, and he ended up in working and trying to fit into society, but he never really did fit in. And he was trying to get some education so he could work here. But on the other hand, nothing worked out. And finally, he committed suicide near a house where he was staying.
He got
His
really
lady
depressed.
had him stay, and then he committed suicide with a gun in back of the house.
Mm.
He was very unhappy, partially because he couldn't go back to Africa. He knew he couldn't get the money. Berner, the guy who sponsored him, was on hard times, so he couldn't get the money. And so, therefore, what do? Well, while he was put in the zoo, people, of course, saw him as an ape and disproved evolution. A lot of stuff in the newspapers which talked about what was going on, and the black pastors objected and said this is demeaning to our to our people, to our race. We don't like this. Besides that, we don't believe in evolution anyways, so we object greatly to what's going on.
Right.
But of course, the evolutionists thought, well, this is one good way of displaying, indeed, that this is evidence of evolution, and therefore they didn't many didn't really mind the exploitation of this young boy. But he was not real happy. He wasn't paid to perform. He was basically there in a cage. And of course,
Right.
he had a monkey in the cage with him, and he knew they were laughing at him, and he didn't like that. And he started throwing things at the visitors. And of course, then that was a problem, and they called the police. And finally, they realized this isn't going to work. So they took him out of the cage. And then the next step is we have to find a place where he can stay and he can work and so on. There are at least three books about full-length books besides this one
Yeah.
about him. And so there's
Yeah.
a lot been written.
How old was he when he killed himself? Do you know?
I would say late 20s, but he was
Oh yeah, very
pretty
young.
young. Of course, they don't have calendars that we had, and so they can only guesstimate how old he was.
Sure.
They could ask him, and I don't know if he really knew how old he was. He was keeping track of birthdays wasn't a major concern where he lived.
Right. Right.
I mean, he knew he was married. We knew that he had children. We knew that, so we figured he was late 20s. But he could have been. Some people estimate he could have been in his early 30s.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
There was discrimination that took place, which by putting people in freak shows and in zoos. But there's another little subtle thing. This is truth pick number 3 that was developed by a cousin of Charles Darwin, Francis Galton, and that was the IQ test. Tell us about how that folds into the idea of evolution.
Okay. The idea is for many centuries, a lot of people believe that, primarily Europeans believe that the blacks were less intelligent than the whites. And this idea comes up occasionally, and the best example is the bell curve by Herrnstein and Murray. And this is the book, The Bell Curve. And they did a study, and they found some difference between blacks and whites in IQ. The problem is IQ tests are very culturally dependent. IQ tests ask questions related to the world that white middle class people in America have, not in the world that black, even black middle class people don't have. And so therefore, very classist. And I used to give the IQ test. I'm licensed to evaluate IQ. And so I'm very familiar with the contents of the test. And it clearly is very racially biased. And so it's obviously you're going to have certain groups that don't do as well, not because they were not as intelligent as others, but because the questions are not part of their culture. And that was a big problem. Huge
Have
problem.
they been able to do things to adjust that, or is it just basically the whole thing is just not doesn't work at all?
Well, the problem really was that the whole test is abused. The point was in France, you had students that weren't doing very well. And so the principal would say, which students need some tutoring, need some work out of class. And so the teachers were to pick students who were not doing as well. Well, you know who they picked. They picked the students that were troublemakers. And they ended up not with the less bright students. They end up the troublemakers. And so they realize this is not working. We cannot ask the teacher because they're going to give us the names of students they want out of their class. And so that was a concern. And so they dropped this test in France to measure them to see whether or not they could indeed succeed in a normal classroom.
So was this IQ test then used to substantiate evolutionary biases or evolutionary realities or what have you? Was
No,
it used
enormously, because certain groups, like people from Africa, people that they thought were less evolved than the whites, these tended not to do as well. And of course they didn't because the cultural difference, not because they were actually less intelligent. I should mention that intelligence depends upon what you're looking at. There is 120 estimated different IQs. There's the one to place you at a grade in school. There's an IQ in your music, in sports, in perception, in certain abilities, in music. So you have many different IQs. You have many different skill sets. And one person may do really well in music, be a genius in music, but have very low performance in other areas. And so therefore, you have to look at what is the purpose? What are you using this test for? And that is
Well,
what's
Jerry,
pretty.
you probably ought to know some academics are smart as a brick, smart as a whip, but when it comes to common sense, dumb as a brick. Probably don't have any common sense at all, you know. And
That
you then, I look at some things, and you look at even low job, low jobs like working at a McDonald's, for instance. I don't think a lot of PhDs would do well. You know what I mean?
that's true. It's my
So,
wife brings that out. She says, "You're well educated. Why don't you know how to cook a cake or make a certain meal?" So, well, my PhD was not in French
not,
fries. It was not in this area. I have a skill in certain areas. Other areas, I don't have the same skill set.
That's exactly right. Then, so the IQ falls short unless you differentiate or accommodate whichever skill set or what cultural background they seem to have had. And I don't know that would seem to be awfully complicated and convoluted to even make that even work anymore. Do they not use it? Do they still use IQ tests at all?
Well, I use it a lot when we evaluate people for some type of program. For example,
Okay.
a person wanting to get into a certain kind of adults, mostly we work with. If a person wanting to get into a certain program, are they eligible to get into that program? Or do they need special education or do they need tutorial work?
Okay.
So, as a way of placing them, we gave them the IQ test, which would give some indication of where they were at. Now, there's two basic parts. One is verbal, which is basically vocabulary, and the other is numerical, which is basically numbers. And then there's actually three. The other is spatial, and that is where you put
Ah,
together puzzles and you have different things you assemble, and that helps evaluate your spatial intelligence. And so there are other tests as well, but those are some of the basic ones that
okay.
help you evaluate where the person's at.
So there can be some usefulness of it, but the real problem comes in is when it's been used in the past to try to substantiate an evolutionary bias in favor of one race or a person or one culture as opposed to another. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. For decades, Jews were seen as less evolved than whites.
Oh my
And when
goodness.
they gave the Jews the tests in this country, military, they found a significant number were very below average. Well, we know that Jews as a whole are certainly not on the average below average.
Yeah.
So therefore, we know that there's a problem. And now we realize that there is a major problem in the tests that they use, primarily because these Jews were from Europe. They had different culture than we have. And naturally, they're not going to do as well as we did, and therefore as we do, because the test is designed for middle class whites. And
Okay.
therefore, they didn't do as well. And therefore, they had a high percent who had a problem in the military because they, according to the test, they were not very intelligent at all. And this was
Oh,
primarily Jews and Eastern Europeans because Europeans has a different culture than, of course,
right.
middle class WASP German English Americans.
Okay, we're going to do the truth to pick number 4, and
Oh,
that's
one of my favorites, Doug. Oh boy.
Margaret Sanger. So we're going
Which
to
one,
talk.
Margaret Sanger?
Yeah,
Yeah, Margaret Sanger,
Okay.
an evil woman.
Margaret Sanger is very well known for pushing female birth control. She was the founder of Planned Parenthood. And basically, she was trying to say women are poor, don't have the money. They need to be able to get rid of their babies so that they were not able, because they were not able to take care of their child. And she, in her efforts to get money and support, she basically said, here, there are women who are poor, they're raped, they're uneducated, they're pregnant. We need to help these women. You can't help them when they have to take care of 2 or 3 kids. So therefore, abortion is one solution to the problem. Well, part of what she wanted to do was in this book is what, 400 pages that basically covers Margaret Sanger's eugenic legacy. So this whole book's about her eugenic goals. And one of her goals was she wanted to eliminate or reduce at least the black population. So most of
Which
her birth
population?
control, her
The
black,
black.
she
Oh
wanted to
yeah.
reduce the black population.
Okay.
So most of her clinics were in black neighborhoods, and she was pretty close, but not, it wasn't a secret what she was doing. She got the black pastors basically to
Hmm.
convince the members of her church, young women who got pregnant, to get an abortion. And so she was saying that was to help the people, but one of her goals was to reduce the black population. In
Sure.
fact, today, still a large number of these Planned Parent clinics are found in black neighborhoods. Not all. There's still some that are found elsewhere, but the large number are found in poor areas, especially black areas, because indeed she wanted to reduce the black population because she was eugenicist and indeed was very supportive of programs that would do this. Now, again, she couldn't be open about it, but she didn't really hide it that much. It was there, and you could determine indeed what she was trying to do.
Motivated by evolution, no doubt.
Well, yeah, she was influenced by eugenics, and she was trying to reduce the inferior population. And that inferior population was, among others, was among African Americans. And so that's what she did. And was pretty, she was a Darwinist. She was probably agnostic would be the best term, but she was determined to fix the world up according to eugenic ideas. And one way of doing that was, of course, to reduce this unwanted population of babies that she thought should be reduced. In fact,
wasn't the eugenics idea part of the Nazi kind of agenda? Was that eugenics part of that? And some
well,
of the
eugenics was central to the whole Nazi movement. Basically, what they were trying to do was, besides gaining land, of course, they need to gain land so they can increase their population. But basically, what they wanted to do was reduce the population of inferior individuals, and that was primarily Jews, Slavics, Poles, and other groups that they thought were inferior. And of course, Hitler was very, very influenced by these ideas because he was very influenced by Darwinism, and he was partially because Darwin's ideas went to Germany through Haeckel. Haeckel translated Darwin's work. Haeckel and others translated Darwin's work into German, and what he got wide circulation in Germany. And of course, among those influenced by that circulation was Adolf Hitler. And so I think a good illustration of how eugenics was central in the war was, why didn't Germany conquer Britain? They tried. They didn't. They moved to the West because how many Jews lived in Great Britain? Not many. How many Jews lived in Russia? Millions. And so therefore, he was focused on conquering Russia and Poland because there was a large Jewish population. Wipe out that population, take over the land, and then Aryans can move in that area and then have big families and populate that part of the world to the Aryan race.
Truth pick number 5, Sigmund Freud.
Problem with Freud was he basically accepted the evolutionary worldview. And accepting that worldview, what he wanted to do was basically understand what made people tick and try to help them. And one idea which he had was evolution is at the basis or the core. We behave the way we do because of evolution, and therefore evolutionary theory was important in helping us understand other people and what made them tick. And so his theory was not directly but indirectly evolutionary based. And he had what we recognize today as some strange ideas. For example, he felt that fathers wanted to be, or sons at first wanted to kill their fathers because the son's competition for the mother was the father. And this was called the Oedipus complex. And there was others as well that involved the women, the females. The female wanted to kill the mother so the female could have the father. It just gets complex, but in essence,
wow,
it's
I've
an
not
idea
heard
that we
about
don't
this
accept
one.
at all today.
I knew he had a lot of things were sexual in nature that was driving these. Was Freud the one that come up with the idea of the primitive brain and the lizard brain, or is that something new? Is that something different?
That was phrenology developed that idea, but Freud didn't develop that idea so much.
Okay.
But,
I hear people use that today, kind of sort of mockingly, but semi not mockingly, you know?
yeah, the idea of, phrenology, but also by frontal lobotomy, the idea is that we have a reptile brain and a more evolved brain. And
Right.
reptile brain was influential, and people who were crazy, they were because had depression and so on. They did because the reptile brain was controlling too much their body. So what you do is separate the reptile brain from the modern brain, and that way then that will eliminate a lot of problems. And they did that with an ice pick, literally in the eye. They could go in the brain, and you can do this, although it's pretty dangerous and problems. But and he had no small number of patients die, and he had some successes, but when he would separate these two parts, some people were some people were better for a while, but in the end, there were no real large number of long-term examples where it dealt with the problem effectively for the rest of the person's life.
Okay. Who was this that was doing this? Was there one main proponent or not?
Oh, there are a number of
Okay.
several. There was one guy who spent his life pushing
Okay.
this idea, but actually it was tried by a number of people even in Europe as well as America. Several people really got into this idea and were very aggressive in pushing this idea. But the whole basis again was the reptile brain, primitive, people behave poorly. It's because the reptile brain has too much control. We have to separate the two. And of course, the separation they used is very crude. And, of course, there's no such thing, in fact, as reptile brain. But
Yeah.
indeed, they thought there was. And there was some improvement for some people for a short time. The most famous example, of course, is the Kennedy daughter, who was like 15 or 16
Oh,
when she
yeah.
had that done. And it didn't work at all. And she ended up spending the rest of her life in a mental hospital. And
Yeah.
this was to the shame of the senior Kennedy,
Yep. I remember
Joseph
seeing
Kennedy.
that. Yep.
Well, we do not have time for the last one. So,
That's a show in and of itself, Doug. We've talked about vestigial organs, which, well, I'll give the teaser campaign so we can do this and do another one if you want. Yeah.
we'll have to do that some other time. We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution. Thank you, Jerry Bergman, for being on our show.
Thanks,
Thank
Jerry.
you for having me. Thank you.